Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Landon.
Sorry, I was going to say we have with us a
No.
familiar face that
Yeah.
you saw before on part one of our podcast with the amazing Laura Robinson. How are you today, Laura?
I'm very good. How are you guys doing?
We are great. We did tape a part one with Laura that released just last week. So if you have not seen that, that's going to be linked in the show notes. And if you want to watch them in order, you don't have to, but you can. You can check that out first. So we'll have Laura introduce herself for those of you that haven't seen part one. And then we are really excited to get to the second part and more information from Laura. So welcome.
Hi. Yeah, hi. I'm Laura Robinson. I am a recent PhD graduate of Duke University in religious studies. My background is primarily in religion writing. You can hear the whole story of how I got into this on the first show. But yeah, we're just here today to finish up, is this article series I've done on OUR. There's more to come. I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm going to be working on in the future as I get into this. But yeah, no, this is watch the first one if you want more of the background. But we're going to be talking some more today about OUR, effectiveness, anti-trafficking in the field, missions, and just all the constellation of issues around that and how Americans think about and respond to the idea of global sex trafficking.
Absolutely. And your first part that we aired last week just, was on fire. And some of the comments were exactly what I hoped they would be. This is a totally new perspective from what a lot of us, especially in the nuanced Mormon or post-Mormon community, have looked at. So we're really excited to be able to put this part two out. So Landon, why don't we pull up the slides? And we covered in our first episode, there were some various claims that Laura had sort of divided this information or research into 1, 2, 3. We're just going to pick it right up with claim number 4 and let Laura take it away.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So claim number 4 in this article series, so these are all claims that either OUR has made or claims that have been made on behalf of OUR. We're sort of digging into the truth behind it. OUR is effective at freeing children from trafficking and providing them with necessary aftercare. I wrote this section before I got my hands on the FOIA files from the case file, which talks a lot about the issues of aftercare. That whole file is now available through KSL's website. They just dropped the whole thing on their website. So if you want to dig more into this yourself and look at issues of OUR with aftercare of trafficking survivors, all the raw documents are available on there. And I strongly encourage everyone to go check them out themselves. So, OUR is effective at freeing children from trafficking and providing them with necessary aftercare. Before I get started, I did want to add one point of clarification from the last show I did. And this was just a way in which a tone was kind of hitting my ear in the way I was talking about it. I have a tendency to kind of like run through facts really quickly and just sort of explain things out there. And I didn't love the way in which me describing really horrifying things in very straightforward factual terms was hitting my ear in retrospect. So I specifically, this came up around the Port-au-Prince earthquake, right? It's just sort of naming this as a historical event that enters and has the story of OUR and has this major impact on people who would eventually become swept up in the OUR phenomenon because of their earthquake trauma. And so the place I mentioned that is that, the Marty family lost a few family members, and this earthquake killed between 100,000 and 300,000 people. I just wanted to be clear that please don't misunderstand that glancing through this as a historical event. I want to make sure that we are holding space to think of this as a real human tragedy, and specifically where this touches more recent developments is that in the Vice article with that discusses the role of Janet Russin, the psychic, in the raids for Gardaí, there's a part where Janet and Ballard seem to be saying that to Gesno that like your mom is talking, your sister is talking, right? And I know for a lot of people this can be kind of easy to laugh at, that Nephi and all these dead people are talking about. Gesno's mom and sister were killed in the Port-au-Prince earthquake, so this is a tragedy that is continuously evoked and like occasionally capitalized on, it seems like, in OUR operations. So I just want to be careful that we're not talking about this as just a series of events and a series of data that we're going through towards this bigger project of talking about Americans, right? That's not how I want to be approaching this. I want to make sure that we're holding space where this is a real human tragedy and people really died and people are at the center of the story, have been traumatized and re-traumatized, not just because of OUR, but because of these other events around it that become part of this constellation of events that leads to the disastrous and fruitless search for Gardaí. So does that make sense? Sorry, I just want to make sure I said that just to put all this in context. But anyways, we're going to be moving aside from Haiti itself for a bit to talk about this, with the issue of freeing children from trafficking and providing them with necessary aftercare. A big part of this conversation is the issue of OUR collaborating with other organizations. Now, it's not wrong for an organization to collaborate with others, right? And there's been a lot of talk about how a lot of NGOs have overseas have either not heard of OUR or will not work with them. But some of their early raids were very much supported by local police, right? And that's not wrong. It's not wrong to collaborate with other organizations or to work with other police departments. The question that I want to bring to this, though, is specifically, why fund OUR? Like, what is OUR bringing specifically to these projects that no one else can do in these contexts of collaboration, right? So I think one thing that we need to be really clear about, if you've just watched the movies and the documentaries or just taken on OUR material, you might be under the impression that OUR is like this group of ninjas that goes into other countries and frees kids and takes them out. That's not true. You cannot. Yeah, OUR has no jurisdiction to arrest people, right? This is a volunteer operation. So there is always collaboration with police departments when arrests are going to be made. So this does invite the question of, I think, what does OUR add to groups that you need to pay for, right? That if you are being solicited for a donation, what is it about this that can't be done without you paying for it personally? And I think this is sometimes a really tough question to track down, right? And it doesn't always fit with OUR's messaging, right? Like, how often it's come up in past narratives of OUR that the reason why they were founded is because no one else was fighting trafficking. Well, that doesn't seem to be true. If you like, one of their largest operations was Operation Triple Take back in 2014, which was a operation that was headed by several different military forces and police forces. ICE was involved, and it was supported by not just OUR, but a second nonprofit. So I think this is important to think about the fact that, like, there's actually other pieces on the board, and it's very fair to ask as a donor, what couldn't get done with OUR, right? What could not get done without their assistance? And sometimes it's really hard to figure out this information, correlate it, and get substantiation for it. Some early operations have had the involvement of a guy called Stephen Cass. He's the founder of an organization called Breaking Chains. He had an extended interview with Lynn Packer, where he maintained that on the whole, he was doing most of the intelligence in the operation. And then OUR would kind of like fly down to some cameras and some celebrities and do basically shoot day on this thing itself. But the operation itself was functionally over before it even happened, because like the person who was getting the prosecutorial evidence that could be taken to a police officer was Stephen Cass himself. Now, this is just Breaking Chains' claim, right? You know, I'm not saying that they are therefore right over against OUR, but there is some dispute in this area of who is actually doing the intelligence gathering, who is actually doing that, right? And it actually seems that there's times in which these other organizations felt like OUR was adding issues, right? That like adding volunteers was creating problems, which is, it's not terribly surprising that would be the case, right? So I think that's just, it's important to remember that I'm not saying all this to like condemn OUR, saying like they shouldn't have collaborated with it. Hardly that. It's just that the messaging on this front is really confusing. Does OUR do something no one else is doing, or do they collaborate with others? And if they do collaborate with others, what is OUR doing that OUR itself specifically needs the funding, right? Like what is that thing that they are bringing besides cameras? So then that brings us to the issue of like aftercare, right? We talked a lot in the last section about the issue of raid and rescue, right? And what does raid and rescue look like as an anti-trafficking idea, right? So historically, the idea of raid and rescue is that you will go get information through some channel or another that there are people in an area who are trafficking children, and then you try to get them in the act of trafficking them, or you beg them to traffic them for you, as the case may be, in some of these situations. And then the people traffic the kids, and then you rescue them, and then you either provide aftercare for them yourself, or you turn them over to someone else who can do that, right? The thing is that the way the raid rescue model is fundamentally flawed is that it treats rescue and rehabilitation as totally separate phenomena, right? That like, at least we got them out of there, and now we do the extra step of like making sure that like they have some therapy and some counseling. This only makes sense if if by child trafficking victims, we mean kids in a box, right? This is the only context in which it makes sense, is that they are in captivity somewhere and we need to free them. And then their rehab afterwards is kind of like a detachable part. Like, we've already done something really good for them by saving them, but now we're going to like help them out and make sure that they like get the therapy and the care they need. This makes no sense if you have a broader understanding of what trafficking is, and the fact that some of these kids might never have been trafficked before, right? Or some of these kids might be the children of sex workers or even pimps themselves, who were willing to, use these kids because of the availability of money. Or these kids have no parents and guardians, and they're doing this for survival sex because otherwise they're not going to be able to eat and they don't have any money, right? This makes less sense if you think about trafficking that way, not as like, these kids were kidnapped and they were all being held somewhere and we got them out, and now, we do this bonus step of helping them out. It doesn't make any sense if you don't think that's what trafficking is, because what you would then have to understand is that trafficking can't be stopped by a rescue. That's not how it works. Like, trafficking is a outgrowth of poverty and, oftentimes like sexualized violence or like sexist violence that is endemic to a certain culture. Like, this is a lot of what's come out about India and Nepal. Or lack of meaningful economic opportunities in an area, or lack of education, or there's a lot of different causes. And if you think of trafficking as caused by traffickers who go kidnap the kids and then make them have sex for money, then you're not going to understand that Aftercare is actually the entire project. It's not the second project. And if you think of trafficking as caused by this constellation of social problems and issues, by which exploitative sex work for even sometimes people under 18 is a form of survival, you're going to understand that if you don't do aftercare, you actually have not done anything for these people, right? Like, you have not saved them from anything. You have done this very performative act and put them back into the same system that is now completely still intact, and still put those people back in the place where they were, right?
So, Laura,
here,
I think what I hear you saying is that the aftercare is really the primary purpose.
Yes. Yeah.
Not the secondary purpose.
Yeah, I really do think, the more you start reading about this, the more you start to realize that aftercare is kind of a misnomer, right? That aftercare is actually the thing that prevents trafficking. And like, the rescue portion is oftentimes built on misunderstandings of what this actually looks like, right? And that's a problem, because OUR is very rescue forward, because that's the part that makes good television, right?
That's
exactly
that word we all learned, right?
No, exactly. And what's kind of crazy is that if you watch the show Abolitionist, you see them continuously running into this problem. And I'm going to tell you two examples from it. The first one is sorry, I completely lost my train of thought. I want to make sure I remembered both of these. Hang on. One of them was, okay, I'll tell the first one first then, and I'll try really hard to make sure I can think of the second one. The first example you see of this is there's an incident in the I think it's the Boca Chica episode, where they're driving downtown trying to get intelligence. Okay, hang on. I'm going to write the second one down because I'm going to forget it.
You're like me, sticky notes all over my computer. Yeah. Well, and there's so much to say and so much to process about this, that every thought leads to another tangent. And
exactly. And I was like, I want to make sure I get them both. So the first one that comes up is there's an episode of Abolitionist where they're driving downtown, and one of the rescuers sees a kid he saved from trafficking last year. And she's doing the same thing she was doing last year. She's walking the street, right? And they come and they get her, and then they sit her down for an interview, and they're like, they ask what happened and like going to Aftercare. And the way she explains it is basically that Aftercare was really a disaster for her, and that like it caused a lot of problems for her. And they offer her a plane ticket to one of their halfway houses in another country, and she doesn't take it. And you can't blame her, right? That's a pretty big die to roll on going with people who you've already interacted once and it didn't go well, and now they're going to take you to another country to, I mean, call me crazy, but that just sounds like all kinds of issues and like a really high risk, possibly low reward possibility. And so again, this idea of, Aftercare being the second thing, no, it's not. If you don't have a plan for what people can do for money besides survival sex, or besides entering sex work, or having their children get involved into sex work because they are looking for some kind of economic opportunity. If you can't provide that, it doesn't really matter what else you've done, right? If there is no work in your town except for sex work, and mom and dad can't feed the kids, but you do have these teenage daughters, it doesn't matter if somebody kicked down a door and dragged them out and arrested their pimp and gave them back to their parents and said, like, look, we saved them. Now we just need to find a new pimp because this is the only economic opportunity we have. And so I think that's really important to remember that, Aftercare is not ancillary. It is the entire project. And I'll give you a second example. There's another episode of Abolitionist where they've been talking to a pimp, and they say that he promises to bring them kids, and that he's finally only able to bring them 2. He can't find any more than 2. And they're all really frustrated and really disappointed. And they really lean on this guy that like, we really need more than 2. And somehow they finally, they give him some more time, and he's finally able to get more than 2 kids. And then they arrest the guy and they save the kids, right? Okay, so here's the thing. There is no understanding of trafficking by which this makes sense, unless you are thinking of trafficking as like, you go to Old Navy and you want the medium purple sweater, but it's only available in small and large. And you really, really ask the person who's monitoring the area, like, you please go check in the back to see if you have a medium. And then like, they maybe have like, that's the model of trafficking. This makes sense, which is not how grown-up experts think about trafficking, right? There's the every other model that, if you think through it, makes less sense. One is this guy is only able to recruit 2 children, and you're really pushing him to recruit more. That's insane. That's a crazy choice. And then the second version of this that doesn't the second version of this understanding that doesn't really make sense is this idea that, at least we're going to be able to go into an area and arrest all the pimps who will deal in children, right? And now the pimps who would use minors, we took care of them, right? There's a few problems with this. One is that a thing that comes up again and again in the footage that they have, and kind of saved Paul Hutchinson's bacon, apparently, if he's to be believed, is the fact that a lot of these people are actually just picking young-looking 18 and 19-year-olds and saying that they're kids. So, if you haven't really made a country safer by picking off those people, right? And again, that's what Paul Hutchinson says happened, but it's also, this does happen in the footage a lot, is that a guy will say he can bring them kids and then bring them a bunch of people who are clearly 20 years old. But the other big issue with this is that if your goal is to just get the pimp off the street so he can't traffic kids anymore, why does it matter if he has 2 or 30? Yeah. Either it's still illegal, you can still arrest him, right? So like, why go through all this rigmarole of like really begging him to get more kids unless you want better footage, which I think is, again, a plausible motive, because there's no other explanation that makes sense to me. That like, either you are so slow and so uninformed about trafficking that you really think this guy just has kids somewhere and we got to find it. And even then, once you arrest the pimp, then just go raid his house and or his you'll find the rest. Like,
and that's what I wonder. I was thinking, do they have this idea that he has a stable of kids?
I know.
Only brought 2, and they know he has 15 back there, and they're just like, you got to bring them all because we're gonna put him in our van and go save them. Like you said, that's not a realistic.
It's not a real thing. You have to be so out to lunch to think that that's a thing that's happening, especially after you've done multiple ones of these raids. And by now you should really know it's not how it works. So like either you're operating with like such profound ignorance that you have no business being out here.
Well, it's almost like the organization wants more numbers so they can claim more people saved.
That too. Yeah.
Important. Yeah.
Yeah. That too is wanting to drive your numbers. Is that 27 sounds a lot cooler than 2. Yeah. So, just really lean into that. Right. So I think there's a few different issues here. One is just the possible explanations are ignorance such that you really have no business fighting trafficking. If you don't even really know what it is or how it works, then why are you here? Which is a question I just have again and again every time I come up with this. It's like, then why were you there? Then why were you there? It's like, well, we didn't know. We didn't have a plan for Aftercare yet. We didn't realize it was going to be then why were you there? Then why were you there? Just wait and figure it out. And if you can't figure it out, then, maybe change your, anyways. I think it's either ignorance or it's bad motives, right? Is like wanting to punch up your numbers to get a really impressive haul your first year, and you don't really care about the consequences for the people who are involved in this, or you just really think it's going to look cooler on camera if there's a bunch of kids, right? So I think that's just
the tragedy of that is if that's what you're doing, if you're trying to get numbers for TV so that your ratings look good, aren't you really trafficking the kids as well?
This brings us to the issue of secondary exploitation, which is the phenomenon of using somebody's experience as a victim of something for your own benefit, right? Which I think it is very, very difficult to see how secondary exploitation isn't actually like all over this, right? Like if you need trafficked kids for your marketing campaign, if you need trafficked kids for your television show, if you need trafficked kids for your gala or for your Dr. Phil appearance, at some point, then secondary exploitation is a real issue with this. And a lot of times this is actually like really triggering and traumatizing for survivors because being involved in transactional relationships is exactly what their trauma is, right? So even if you're not abusing them, coming in and establishing this highly transactional relationship where their trauma is now something that you can monetize for your ends, and again, like don't tell me this is all about the kids, right? Don't tell me this is all about the kids, because it's also about the television show. It's also about the LLC, and it's also about the Senate campaign, and it's also about getting people to believe in Mormonism, right? There's a lot of motives flying around here that have nothing to do with the children. And if they had something to do with the children, then, leaning on a pimp to provide more kids with you wouldn't make sense, again, unless you were just did not understand the problem you were trying to solve, which is also not a good look. So what else did I want to talk about in this section about
did you hit your second one that you wrote?
I got everything. I wouldn't tell the story about the leaning on the no. It's a great question. Yeah. But then of course, this brings us to the issue of aftercare. One thing I did want to say is that this the data was already not good before the KSL files were publicly released on what exactly aftercare looked like. So I'm able to speak a lot more freely about this now because the case file that there's the on the people who work on this, there's the Vice group, there's the Lynn Packer group, there's a few different little like squads who work on this. A lot of previously, and then there's KSL, right? Previously, the FOIA documents from the court case had been sort of in that network, but then KSL just shot theirs out of a cannon and said, you guys can all have it. So now I can say whatever I want about those. That's fun. So
unleashed.
Yeah, exactly. So, sorry, hang on. Oh yeah. So the story of Aftercare gets even more complicated once we've added in this other stuff. There was already good evidence on the ground that Aftercare was a significant Achilles heel for OUR, right? One is the Meg Conley article in Slate that she was on one of these raids in Boca Chica, where she found out later that the kids were simply just returned to their parents after this raid, which, that's not great. Another one is the fact that if you go to the next slide, that Elizabeth Smart's father, Ed Smart, his organization, this is from Lynn Packer's, one of Lynn Packer's report, his list of quotes from Ed Smart. Elizabeth Smart and OUR had attempted to merge and work together. It did not last very long. It seemed that the Smarts were pretty horrified with what OUR was doing and pulled out pretty quickly. And then a big part of that was Ed Smart was going to be the director of Aftercare, right? He said that in his experience, he said that he was very frustrated with OUR was not telling the truth about things, that they were making stuff up, they were inventing stuff, and specifically that they were not really interested in investing in Aftercare very particularly, right? So there's and what we see since is that OUR has had other Aftercare directors who've had more or less the same experience, right? There's a lot in the KSL, in the files that KSL released from the case file about the fact that the higher ups at OUR wanted to define Aftercare really, really loosely. Again, this is according to their employees. I can't prove this. I'm just saying that this is what's out there, and it would be weird for them to lie because all these people still work in anti-trafficking, right? It's not like they decided, it's not like they took a hard left and decided they were actually super into trafficking, right? Like they still work against, they're still anti-trafficking activists. They just don't work with OUR. One thing that comes up is that OUR kept the idea of Aftercare extremely broad and didn't want to define what they were doing or means test any of it because they didn't want to be accountable for the results. That survivors were routinely contacting OUR looking for services and were told that they weren't supplied. And that overwhelmingly what OUR meant by Aftercare was adoption. This is a theme that eventually shows up that initially the idea of children need families, as it is explained, it's gone through a bunch of different iterations. Like, what exactly is this? It's been called a foundation. It's been called a special project of OUR. Vice seemed to turn up that it was actually an LLC, that it was for profit. But it's been a lot of different things. And the way it was first imagined was this idea of we're going to take kids who survive trafficking, instead of putting them in therapy in their home countries, we're going to take them to Utah and raise them ourselves, right? So a lot of questions there about what that's going to look like, how you can scale that, how are you going to vet the parents, right? How are you going to make sure that they have the care that they need, late stage adoption, late in life adoption, transracial adoption, transnational adoption where children and parents don't speak the same language. These are incredibly fraught and difficult relationships. They can work, but they're hard, and you need a lot of experts involved to make them happen. But then, of course, eventually CNF becomes this idea that it's actually a preventative project, according to the documents in the FOIA, that we're going to adopt kids and raise them in the US so that they're not trafficked, right? Again, this conflicts a lot with OUR's messaging that trafficking is happening right here in the United States and it's happening in Utah and women are getting snatched off the streets. But, the messaging is all over the place, right? But again, you might justifiably say that Aftercare is, it's not Aftercare, like, why, if you adopt a child from South Korea and raise them, how are you providing Aftercare for assault, for trafficking survivors? You're literally not, especially if CNF is, as it has been, paying for infant adoption, right? So this is clearly not, it's hard to square this, right? So, then this gets into the question of like donor relations. If someone says, I want to donate $10,000 for Aftercare, and then it goes into this, adoption of an infant, was the donor's request actually acknowledged? One of the people who worked on the therapeutic side for OUR said that, in her experience, she was when she tried to split off and form her own organization that was going to focus on actual aftercare, on like vocational skills and therapeutic skills, OUR at first didn't want her to do that because it was going to be competition with OUR. Love that competition for, you know, rescuing slaves. OUR didn't want competition anyways. But of course she was eventually allowed to do this without Tim getting mad because they offered things like therapy and vocational skills. They're like, oh, that's right, we don't do that. You know, but then they do advertise that they do aftercare. And then they do have a director of aftercare who they say, you know, again, this is according to the FOIA files. They have this lady, Jessica Mast, who had historically been their director of aftercare, who was going around vetting all the programs overseas and making sure they were working, but she had a BA in biblical studies. Like, what evidence did she, how would she have, you know, I have a sister who actually has a master's in evidence-based social intervention, and you know has gone through all the studies, like the ways in which you lean on like statistics and modeling and you know in random sampling, and like all the different, like understanding whether or not a social intervention is effective is hard work, and it takes experts. It usually takes more than one expert, right? It takes a lot of people working together to evaluate this, and they just have this basically random woman who they've decided is going to be the person who tells them if programs are working or not, right? So, you know, again, people have recently been asking the question of, you know, how come with all the heat Tim Ballard is taking, how come none of the people he's saved have come up and stood up and said that he saved them and that he's a good man? I think this might be part of the explanation, is that if there's just none of these programs in place, or they just don't run effectively, or they're not what anyone actually needs, it might very well be that people have been saved by Tim Ballard who have no idea they were saved by Tim Ballard. Like either because they're back in sex work, or they're back in a trafficking situation, or they're still just really poor and traumatized, right? Like I think that's very possible that like none of these people think of themselves as saved. And I think it's because of this problem of, you know, aftercare, which again is not aftercare, is the entire project, is the entire, you know, legs behind this.
If what I heard you say is that a lot of the aftercare dollars that were raised weren't even spent on the people who were saved, they went towards adoptions of kids who weren't enslaved. It's poverty-stricken children.
If that, like one of the kids that CNF they paid for their adoption was an infant from South Korea. Like South Korea is actually a pretty developed country, right? So like I think that's and again, this is what's shown up in the FOIA documents. And like I've been working really hard to substantiate this. And if you know somebody who had an adoption who was funded by OUR, please tell them to reach out to me. I would love to get some more information about this. I really, this is something that Team Packer, we would love to do more of this. We would really love to dig more into this. So please, 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 if you know anyone who did this, or, you know, we're not here to judge. We're not here to get mad at you. You didn't know, but please reach out to me. We would love to tell your story and help you get to the bottom of what happened.
And I guess we should say, now that you said Team Packer, we of course went into it in the first episode, but Laura works very closely, you know, just sort of, they came across each other and works with Lynn. So it really is Team Packer. So any information.
All the graphics on this are from him. The way in which I started writing this Don't Give OUR Money your series, as I explained, the first one was trying to make Lynn Packer's work accessible to the rest of the way. So it's, you know, Damian Moore does a lot of the international op stuff. Lynn does a lot of the Mormon side stuff. I have been working on a lot of the global ops stuff myself. But yeah, if there's anything you guys want to tell us, please reach out to me. My Substack has my contact information on it. Please, please, please reach out to me. We would love to be able to tell your story. I have made $0 on this. I am not profiting from this. This is entirely a dog with a bone, have to follow the trail story for me. But yeah, we'll talk. But anyways, just wanted to give a little shout out to that.
No, that's great. Can I say since we do have listeners, in addition to viewers, Landon, maybe you could read the graphic here, because before we move on, these are the things that Ed Smart, having, you know, initially thinking this is going to be a great collaboration with Elizabeth Foundation, then he starts to find out how they're operating, goes on a raid, right? Actually, he does go on something. I think I heard he was there or part of something.
He was in Santo Domingo.
Santo Domingo.
Yeah, so the Santo Domingo operation towards the end of 2014 split into two groups. One was the group that went to Puerto Plata and basically spent 5 days milling around on beaches trying to find sex slaves and never did. The second group was the one that, even worse, went to the hill country between the DR and Haiti on the advice of Janet Rustin with Gesno in tow, pretending to be doctors, to go find the labor camp where Gardy was held. There was no labor camp. Gardy was not found. So Ed was on this worst of all possible imaginable missions where, basically everything that could go wrong did. But this was the one that Ed Smart was on. But yeah, I can start. Landon, do you want to read it?
Sure. These are kind of bullet points of what
these are comments that Ed said why he's going to cut ties pretty quickly with any kind of collaboration with OUR.
Yeah, he is totally disillusioned with OUR and Tim Ballard, and totally disillusioned was his quote. When I heard Tim make comments that I felt were not true, I became even more disillusioned. I made proposals about aftercare that were not being taken seriously, and it hurts me to see people pour money into OUR when I feel it's very undeserving.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's again, talking about effectiveness. There's another story here that we could bring in of one of the more recent Haiti ops was this. This seemed to be at the time in which OUR had moved, and we'll talk more about these later. There was a time in which it seemed like OUR was targeting brothels and adult-only hotels that had been in the news for employing women from other countries as sex workers or hotel staff. One of these was Hotel Rojo, Volcan Rojo, which we'll talk about later on in this. But one of these is a brothel in Pétionville in Haiti, where Colombian women were coming to work as sex workers and were, in large part, if you read the media that doesn't come from OUR, Colombia is obviously a country that has had a lot of tremendous instability in the last few years, and Colombian women who were not making a lot of money as teachers or as service workers in Colombia were going to Haiti, where they were seen as very desirable by the Haitian population, and were able to make a lot of money very quickly doing sex work. Now, of course, part of this does involve the element of bonded labor, right? The idea that Haiti was flying, the Haitian brothel was getting these women by paying for their international flights, which the women would not have been able to pay for otherwise, and then taking part of the top off their money as they, to pay back for that flight. And then once they were paid back, obviously they were free to leave, as many of them said they were. And then along that process, whether or not they were borrowing money from there's a lot of dispute over who's borrowing money from who in this process. But anyways, the Tim Ballard version of the story is that these 10 women from Colombia he interacted with woke up one day in Haiti. They were kidnapped and drugged in Colombia and flown to Haiti, where they woke up being raped, and they were trapped in this brothel and locked in if you've ever seen a photo of Tim Ballard holding up a padlock and saying this is the very padlock that was locking them in, right? So the story that other OUR employees tell, not Tim Ballard even, I think Brad Damon tells a version of the story, is closer to what we see in the news reports, right? That the women had come to Haiti and eventually became very unhappy with the arrangement and felt like they couldn't leave because they owed the brothel keeper money and because they didn't speak Haitian Creole or know anyone else in Haiti, right? So I want to be clear. I'm not saying this is fine. This can still be a really exploitative system and still take a lot of agency away from women. But it's also not the same thing as being kidnapped and drugged and taken overseas and raped against your will, right? So I'm not saying that these women should have been left there. I'm saying that it is more complicated. And this is what basically every trafficking story that you read that it can be substantiated looks more like, right? Is people enter into sex work and think it's going to be a shorter period of time or they're going to make more money than they do, or they don't reckon with the problems of culture shock overseas. And there's just a lot of issues with it, right? At any rate, it seems that 10 women in this brothel wanted to leave. Tim Ballard describes a very cinematic chase of them running out and being chased. The footage shows them basically leaving in an orderly manner after an argument with the brothel keeper, but I mean that's basically to be expected at this point. And then the lock itself, it seems like the lock was in the bar area. It wasn't actually like locking the women in anywhere. It was, you know, a lot of times you'll lock, but Lynn gets into that. But anyways, where those women are now, 7 of the 10 were taken to the United States on T visas. A T visa is a visa you can get if you are a trafficking survivor and want to come to the United States. It's incredibly difficult to get, and it often it's often harder to get if you have any kind of if you have a criminal record, you can't get one, which creates a lot of issues for the kinds of people who end up in trafficking. And it doesn't, there's no, a lot of times the O.U.R. story will end with it like, and then they all entered the path to become American citizens. There's no clear path from being on a T visa to being an American citizen. It's not clearer than any other visa, right? It's gonna be a 12-year process. But if you look in the FOIA files, it seems like these women who were brought here in the ones who stayed in the US, that part of how they've been supporting, you know, that their aftercare, as the case may be, is that they live around the OUR area and that they are compensated for promoting OUR. So that's again, this is a thing that seemed to have caused a huge dispute between one of Tim Ballard's employees who worked in Aftercare. Was this question of, you know, you can't give people money for supporting your organization when they've survived trafficking. Like, you can't just enter into a transactional relationship with them. That's traumatic. And then the other part of it too is, you know, these are women who came from from Colombia. Watching footage of them, it doesn't seem like they speak English. You know, some of them have been, one of them was on Dr. Phil with Tim Ballard and apparently had like a massive psychotic breakdown after that because like the cameras were like way too much for her. Which, you know, again, this is all very predictable if you know anything about trauma survival. But again, like what is the aftercare plan? It's why, you know, I keep going back to the phenomenon of adoption being your plan for aftercare. Is there a plan for aftercare that actually is about giving women and children agency and power over their lives and the ability to support themselves and to make money? Or is it to basically like create new systems of dependence, right? Or to do we want women to be independent and able to make their own choices, or do we want them to be women that we think Mormon women should be like, right? Like, do we want them to be, you know, not really independent, right? Or like for kids, right? Do we want them to grow up in certain houses and develop this like certain kind of theology and not grow up in their own country? And so I think that's just sort of the issue is what do you even mean by aftercare at some point? You know, if it's not really about establishing avenues by which women can't choose or not choose sex work, as the case may be, then what is it? Then what is it for? And I think it's hard to answer this question sometimes, I think, in OUR literature. So but that's that.
It's complex. It's a very complex issue that a lot of us on the surface don't even think about until you start thinking, and then you realize, and there's a rabbit hole to go down for sure. Yeah.
Of just like, where are these women now, and what does it mean to take care of them? And I think that another thing that is weird is, you know, of course you do have these aftercare facilities that the lady with BA in biblical studies apparently goes and says are good. But, you know, it's weird to me that a lot of this best documented aftercare practice is all in the US, right? Mm-hmm. You know, like, is there an understanding of flourishing that doesn't include being in the United States, right? You know, and then that raises all kinds of cultural issues. So,
well, I think that ties very much in with Tim's philosophy and his teachings of patriotism and as being God's chosen country, and that's why he's bringing them there, because it sells to two of his audiences, you know, that are stopping sex trafficking and the people that are these ultra patriotic QAnon type.
Yeah, no,
So
absolutely.
maybe aftercare is just getting people safely to God's country. Maybe that's all it takes. And then
It's
you're
hard
good
to
after
not
that.
it's hard to not see that in some of this in some of these programs, right? Like I've never seen another anti-trafficking organization that is this committed to adoption of kids who haven't been trafficked, right? So it is just, it's weird. And then, of course, it's really, this has come up a few different times. Like Jimmy Rex spoke publicly about his experience with OUR after these allegations started to break, and said that, I tried so many times to get updates on kids we'd saved. I never got any. And of course, like it seems like on the whole, the cases that we can confirm of what happened next are they're in the US. We sent them right back to their parents, or no one will tell you. So that's not great, right? That's not a great record for an organization that's supposed to be helping and saving people, right? Is that either we didn't help them and we can prove it. We took them to the United States because we have no systematic plan of what it means for women and children to thrive other than be in Mormon families and be dependent on us. Or we're just never going to talk about them again. Like, that's weird. It's really weird. Don't like the way it's.
If you look at that in the Mormon framework, it's very much like missionary work.
Yeah.
You find them, you baptize them, don't know what happened to them after that.
Leave them in the system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's not even Mormons on that front, right? Like Christians do the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Of, get somebody to not that Mormons aren't Christians, but
we know what you're saying.
Yeah, right. But Protestants also, evangelicals also do the whole pray the prayer with me. If you want to know for a fact you're going to go to heaven tonight, then repeat these words. Okay, congratulations. You are now saved by faith. And and then just take off into the night, right? That's this happens to other people.
Change your life at all. Yep.
Yeah,
that's right. You're in God's hands now. You don't need us. You're in God's hands. So good luck.
Yeah. But you did get fire insurance, is what some people jokingly call it in evangelicalism, right? Yeah. So, okay. Anyways, the prevalence of trafficking means we shouldn't question organizations that are trying to find it. I'm writing
5. We should
claim 5 if you're listening.
Okay.
Yeah, the prevalence of trafficking means that like anything you do to fight this massively prevalent, super common problem is a good thing. Okay, two problems here. One is the idea that so there was a few different things. There's actually a few different things going on here. I broke the claim down to 2 different parts. Is that like trafficking is too big of a problem for anybody involved to face criticism, in that at least attempting to solve the problem is better than nothing, right? So there's a few different issues here. One is that none of this has anything to bear on OUR, because it is simply false that no one is fighting trafficking as effectively or simply at all as much as OUR. That's simply false. Other organizations are getting better results, are working more systematically in the community. And a lot of times these are like led locally by certain, but by women who understand their own context, right? Survivor-led organizations generally look to me, when you read their materials, they just make more sense because survivors know what people need, right? So it's not true OUR is the only organization that's doing anything about this, or that like no one's getting the results that OUR is. Like, no, OUR is actually, no one's getting results like OUR is, because OUR's results are not good. It's not encouraging. But then the other part of this is this idea that trafficking is so big that we need all hands on deck, or that no one who is, or that at least doing something is better than nothing. I talked a lot in the last episode about the problem of the thinking that at least we did something model, right? Because the problem is that it's not true that there was a baseline, like did nothing changed, and did something, either it stayed the same or it got slightly better, right? It is incredibly easy in development work, especially in a problem that you seem to not really understand, or a culture you seem to not really understand. It's really easy to do a lot of harm, right? So we talked about that a lot with the issue of, the very first raid that OUR ever did, the sting on an orphanage run by Eros Dalagrand, who was arrested and was, it seemed, put in jail. I don't have all the details on that. for doing something that does not look like sex trafficking. And if you are convinced you're going to find sex trafficking every time you turn over a stone, you can read what she did through that lens and be like, the thing that, that shows up all the time in OUR literature is like, oh, she sold Gardy before she never had Gardy. She never had Gardy. There's no evidence she ever had him. She had paperwork. She had she kept track of social workers who were in and out of the facility, keeping track of what kids were there. Returning medical missionaries from year to year had paperwork on who was there. She didn't have him, right? And that's or if she did, she had masterminded some scheme so that he was never going to be seen by the outside world, in which case it's weird she didn't just tell anybody when she was arrested. But no, there's no evidence she ever had him. And again, if you take the fact that she was willing to go through the passport office to expedite an adoption is evidence that she's a human trafficker, because no one would ever do that if they had good intentions. Well, maybe it's in the US that might be true, right? But in Haiti, it's not necessarily true at all, because a lot of people bribes are a huge part of how these how organizations are able to work with government systems. And I'll give you an example. One of there's Lynn Packer has a whole Gesno Marty Gardy's father ran this orphanage Foyer de Sion. And Lynn Packer has a whole section on it in one of his videos, and OUR had a public facing director of it. And it seems that a thing that's constantly happening is that money is disappearing, right? That organizations can't get receipts for this or that, or this, everything is so expensive, but it doesn't seem like any of the money is actually being spent on the orphanage. And here's the thing is the thing that's pretty obvious to me is that I would bet Gesno Marty was paying a fair amount in bribes to get things to work for him. And I don't judge him for it, because that's what it means to run an organization. This is an experience most people have, right? So, again, this question of, if we're going to compare people in Haiti that this is a good orphanage director and this is a bad orphanage director, if you just look at the numbers and the history of running these facilities, it would not surprise me. I don't even like to use the word bribe in these cases, because I think that bribe implies, something really crooked and ugly. But just the reality is that, this is a government that's not going to do something if you don't have something in it for them. And my hunch is, for people who were saying we didn't understand where the money was going, it was constantly disappearing, it might be a cultural issue that Gesno couldn't explain that to people. And again, this is speculation. It's just that, if you watch the whole report, it seems like your options that are available is, massive mismanagement or embezzlement. I think a better explanation is just that this is what it means to run an orphanage in Haiti, that you got to pay people off. So, again, if we're going to compare these cases and say, well, what Eros is doing, who would pay bribes but a criminal? Well, a Haitian would, right? This is just part of what this is part of what this looks like. And if you throw somebody in jail and get them hurt and take away their livelihood, all to find a kid that she didn't have, that's not, well, at least we did something. No, it would have been better if they'd never done that. But anyways, and then that's happened 1,000 times, right? Again, look at the whole thing with the psychic, right? How many people almost died because of OUR cruising in with camera equipment into an area where people thought they were trying to take natural resources because a psychic told them there was a labor camp there, right? How many people almost died over that? How many people have actually been hurt? And, a lot of these stories we're never going to tell, in part because OUR doesn't actually document, I looked at a list of their operations, even just in the Dominican Republic, and they've wiped almost all the information about most of them on their website. They don't even document a lot of what they do. So a lot of these stories we're never going to know, because we're not even going to know what they were doing, right? And some of the stuff is really shadowy. But how many people almost died in Haiti because Janet the psychic said to go to this or that place? How many years of Gesno's life did OUR waste? Having him drive around the countryside telling him his kid was just out of reach, right? How many of those years would have been better for him to be home supporting his family and grieving with them, right? This wasn't just a good deed gone wrong. This is something that, like, at some point, a cooler head and someone who was less convinced of their own specialness should have been there to say that this is not doing any good and we're actually hurting people, But so that's that's just the whole issue of would it have been better to not do it at all, right? To which I think a lot of times, there might be specific instances where it's not true, but a lot of the stuff that's been really well documented on the OUR front, I think it's obvious it would be better if it had never happened. It's obvious to me. But anyways, just on the numbers game. I have an article coming out this week called "The People Who Invented Trafficking," which is just sort of the phenomenon of how this idea of human trafficking as it exists in the American cultural imagination came to be. But it seems that a critical element of the way in which this became a thing people started to think about and worry about and like visualize in their heads was Nepalese and Indian feminists coming to the United States and working with the UN to talk about human trafficking in their home countries, right? And the way in which this kind of got caught up in the public imagination was this idea that, well, if this is happening, then it's going to be hitting the U.S. soon, right? It's like they're going to start trafficking the people in here. So people started hearing about an international problem and started making it a U.S. problem, right? We already had a cultural framework for the idea of the inherent desirability of white women and children, with like the Mann Act and a lot of like anti-miscegenation laws and this sort of general suspicion of people from other country and races and the idea that they must want to rape our women and children. This is an old like white anxiety, right? This is as old as as old as colonialism and as old as race, is the idea that white women are very desirable to other countries, and of course they're going to want to kidnap and rape our women, right? So you have that. You have this sort of newfound awareness of abuses happening overseas, and then you have, by the time the U.S. starts making foreign policy on anti-trafficking, starts passing anti-trafficking acts. Again, this is part of why it's so annoying when people are like, no one was talking about trafficking. No, we passed like a law a year about trafficking from 2000 on. No, what starts to happen is that people start trying to get an idea of how often is trafficking happening, right? So people start like basically clipping newspaper pieces from around the world and putting together numbers of stuff that's being found, and they come up with these huge numbers. They come up with this idea that trafficking must be growing really fast because unlike drugs or guns, you can sell a human body many, many times. So that's why it's so big, right? When like you absolutely can't sell a gun many times. But anyways, but this narrative emerges that it's so much bigger than any of us can imagine. And if we're only seeing this portion, then it must be 10 times that, because so much of this is being organized by these, again, the idea of shadowy cartels of evil foreign people who want our women and children is an old belief in the West. This, we've associated with Jews, we've associated it with, business people, we've associated with Asia. This is an old phenomenon in the United States that we've just already had this whole structure to plug in with new vocabulary and ideas. This idea that these incredibly well-equipped, dangerous people just over the fence somewhere are all doing this. And, and this is one of Lynn Packer's things where he talks about how many local news stations in Utah would just uncritically repeat numbers that O.U.R, and again, O.U.R didn't invent some of the numbers. It seems like they, according to the FOIA files, it seems like they invented a few of them. But a lot of these numbers were already there from other organizations that were kind of like hopping on the anti-trafficking panic bandwagon, right? That, there's 100,000 kids in the U.S. That are enslaved, or, there's 2 million children being, there's a bunch of these really big numbers. And then sometimes, what you see with like people like with Sean Reyes in the past is that this is bled effortlessly into kidnapping language, right? And it's even been in O.U.R marketing. It's like, we exist to save kids who have been stolen, right? Which, it's like, what does that mean, right? One of the numbers in the FOIA request that it does seem that was invented was that Tim Ballard came up with this idea that every 3 minutes a child is stolen, right? Which, is kind of some funny math from some of the numbers that are claimed about. But the long and short of it is, at this point in history, what happened after, Homeland Security spent its first billion on anti-trafficking initiatives is that no one was actually able to find trafficking victims in the United States. The numbers were just not as high as people thought they should be. And criminologists started to say that, it doesn't seem, there's some real questions here. Obviously there's, anytime you're talking about sexualized violence, there is this question of, do people not want to come forward, or are they ashamed of it? But even then, the numbers don't quite work out to be at the scale at which people are saying. Even if you think that the unreported rate is as high as it is for rape, it doesn't seem like the numbers are as high as people have claimed. So the reality is the Polaris Project that runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Most organizations in the UNICEF, for one thing, DHS. Most organizations today will make no prevalence data claims about trafficking, that we just don't know how often it happens. We know how often people report it. We know how many convictions there are. We know how many arrests there are, but we actually have no idea how often this happens. And part of this is just the proliferation of trafficking language into, when this burst onto the American scene in because of activists in Nepal and India, it was much more what people think about when they think about trafficking, right? Is kids who are in brothels and are advertised either online or in person for people to sexually exploit, right? But then, of course, as the problem of we're not finding any sex trafficking victims being smuggled across the border in boxcars emerges, then a lot of times the language of trafficking is just broadened, right? So then this becomes an issue with getting grants and police work in the United States, is people who want to get anti-trafficking grants, but they can't prove that anyone is being smuggled across borders or against their will in their town. Well, okay, then we're going to get one of these grants. We're going to go after people who are having sex with their dealers to get drugs, and we're going to call that our anti-trafficking task force, right? So part of why the prevalence data thing is so difficult is because the definition of trafficking is so sprawling. It includes labor elements. It includes, almost all living organ donors, especially ones that involve transactions, are counted under the heading of trafficking. Forced marriages, all kinds of labor issues, even wage theft. Even some forms of marrying for visas are now categorized as trafficking. That if you marry an American man and come over here and find yourself in a situation where you're taking care of his surviving kids, you can't leave the house, what we would generally call a domestic violence situation. Some organizations now call that a trafficking situation, right? So part of the issue is that this language has just ballooned, that every time, everything that is kind of like something else is now put under the heading of trafficking, even though none of these problems are fought in the same way with the same tools. Some of them can't even be fought with law enforcement, right? But they all fall into this category. But then this is part of where these huge trafficking numbers come from. And then people think, when you hear something on the news that there are 30 million people being trafficked today, people think 30 million kids are being kidnapped from their parents and being smuggled across national lines in boxcars for sexual exploitation, when in fact every part of that is a small fraction of what we call trafficking, right? It's kids, small part of what we call trafficking. Sexual exploitation, small part of what we call trafficking. Going across international lines, incredibly small part of what we call trafficking. And then kidnapping, a minuscule amount, right? Minuscule amount. So the problem is that people hear that trafficking is so common and they don't understand what's being claimed, right? And people, I think this is where a lot of the really intense emotions around this come from, of we can't criticize Tim Ballard, right? He's saving so many kids. The number of kids that Tim Ballard would be capable of saving is so small. Even if he actually did anything for him, which, again, is an open question, the number of kids who are victims of this particular crime he apparently specializes in is just really tiny, so it doesn't the prevalence data doesn't say what people think it says. And if you dig into numbers a little bit, and especially like what, cases from the Polaris Project that have actually been substantiated on their hotline, which, that's the other thing, is that a lot of this turned into different awareness campaigns of encouraging people to look for the signs of trafficking. But, the signs of trafficking are a nebulous concept that doesn't really make a ton of sense. Most people would not be able to spot trafficking if it bit them in the face. And it's this largely turned into an excuse to harass interracial couples, right? So yeah, like people don't understand what trafficking, what high trafficking numbers mean. They don't mean what people think they do. And that's why it's not necessarily true that like we can't criticize OUR because they're fighting such a huge problem. Look, I understand that harm coming to kids is an incredibly emotional and difficult thing. I understand that it makes people really angry. And, there's no one in the culture that we hate as much as child abusers, right? Like no one does harder time in prison than child abusers. No one, we have a very strong lowest of the low sense of this, right? And I understand why it makes people angry. But the good news is that kind of crime is not nearly as common as it's historically been claimed. The bad news is that child sex abuse is incredibly common. The issue is that we fixate on the wrong thing, right? We fixate on the idea of child traffickers when actually most people are abused by people they know. And most cover-ups aren't happening at this massive cartel level of international billionaires who are selling kids again and again. It's that, the school doesn't want to deal with the fact that the soccer coach is a child molester, or the church's, recent case I read about, the church doesn't want to reveal that the pastor's son is a sex abuser of the children there and wants to, doesn't want to lose their cash cow, big famous pastor, right?
That's a huge issue that we're familiar with on our side here as Mormons. So it really is. I think, Landon, do you want to read the typical purported unvetted facts that we have? This is an awesome
Lynn Packer,
yeah, because this just kind of shows what we're talking about here. That and it's I don't know. I think we're kind of hardwired to believe these huge narratives and these huge stories. It resonates with you, and then when you really have to dig down and find out what's really going on, that's more complex and it's harder to do. Easier just to take this in. You feel like you said, so emotional, so horrified. It's very easy to internalize that. So why don't you read these, Landon, really quick? These are, I think, from Lynn's, and it's what Laura's talking about here.
Utah news outlets that Ballard's making these claims to. The first one's to Channel 2 KUTV.
And these are typical purported unvetted facts. These are examples of what we're talking about.
Yes. He says there's 100,000 children in the United States forced into the commercial sex trade, and they move them around a lot. Another claim at KSL Channel 5, there are 2 million of these kids being exploited sexually. That was in 2014. Fox 13 in Salt Lake. Ballard said thousands of kids are being smuggled into the U.S. every year, forced into sexual slavery, labor slavery. It's a big deal. And then to the Salt Lake Tribune, O.U.R. Aftercare Director Jessica Mass. So this is Jessica Mass, not Ballard. The organization is also committed to taking care of survivors and following up with them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And we've talked about that last issue is probably not as vetted as it should be. But yeah, I mean, if you don't believe me, you can call Polaris right now and ask them just how many kids are trafficked North America today. They won't tell you because they won't commit to any prevalence number. And most organizations have gone that way, that like we actually just don't know how many people are trafficked, right? And to me, this is also part of just this bigger problem of the fact that we don't really know what trafficking is. We don't really know what causes it. We don't know how often it happens. We don't know where it happens. We don't know when it happens. We don't know what ages it affects. We don't know how common it is. Like we don't know how much money it makes. We actually just don't know anything. And to me, that's kind of a huge issue with all of this, is that if we can't define it and we can't understand, explain it, like this isn't just even limited to OUR. This is a broader issue that people get really agitated about these stories, but we actually just have no idea how common they are. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that's being described here, it's really hard to find any instances of it happening, right? It's really hard to find any instances of kids being taken from their homes in Latin America and smuggled over the border for sex. It's really hard to find evidence for that. And historically, the evidence that Tim Ballard gave was the story of Earl Buchanan, which we now know was false. So, just doesn't seem like it's if trafficking is as common as these organizations say it is, then we're not looking for it in the right places because we can't find it.
And I think that's important. I don't know anyone who has been sex trafficked, but I know lots of people who were sexually abused by somebody in a home or a family member or a friend.
Or church.
Yeah. The first person I ever met who was sex trafficked was because I wrote these articles and she thought they were really good. But before that, otherwise, I think it's, but as you say, I know a shocking number of rape survivors. I know a shocking number of domestic violence survivors. I know a ton of child sexual abuse survivors. Met my first trafficking survivor after I started this. So, but anyways, this brings us to number 6, which, this was going to be in the part of the claim 6, which was, did I, hang on.
We might have them.
Oh, yeah. No, exactly.
Do we need to flip it? We can.
No, it's cool. I've forgotten where I had put this. Yeah, is when we were talking about sorry, I wanted to make. Oh yeah, if you're, this kind of goes back to this question of that we raised earlier of it's better to do something than to not do anything, right? And this is another one of Lynn Packer's graphics on people who've been involved in this. I've talked at length about the issues with Haiti and some of the stuff that went on there and not understanding that. But I also think part of the issue here, and this has been an issue that's come up with OUR in a few different areas, is the issue of collaborating with politicians in police forces, right? OUR has taken a fair amount of criticism for collaborating with people who seem to be corrupt or were, repressing minorities for, this came up in Thailand with OUR working with police forces that seem to be using OUR resources. I can't quite remember how this one went, but the question was whether or not the police were basically mostly cracking down on political dissidents and not child traffickers, right? But this comes up a lot in a lot of different stories, and one of the big ones is Haiti, right? OUR was very active in Haiti at the beginning. It seems that they stopped, according to Dave Lopez, the former director of ops, sometime before 2020. But before they did, they had they made a lot of hay over these good Haitian politicians they were working with who were really committed to fighting trafficking, right? And they give awards to them in the movie Operation Tucson. They gave awards to them in Haiti. They flew them to Utah so Sean Reyes, the attorney general, could honor them there. There was a lot of issues with this idea that Operation Underground Railroad had found these legitimate politicians who they were supporting because they were so committed to fighting corruption in the Haitian government that was making it easier for traffickers to get away. And again, this is part of this bigger problem of not knowing what you don't know. Is who I don't know. I mean, Tim Ballard said that saying that you can't work with people who've had issues with corruption is insane because, like, what organization hasn't had corruption? You don't understand. This is not, no one is denying the CIA and FBI haven't had corruption issues, but like it's Haiti currently has no democratically elected people in government. They have none. So in a lot of times, like the line between the police force and the gangs there are incredibly blurry, and sometimes it changes based on who happens to be in power in a certain area. And these, some of the politicians, Dubious, the attorney general in Haiti, who they really pumped up as much as they did as being this anti-fraud guy, there's actually a lot of evidence that he was himself really corrupt, right? So, again, if you don't know, why would you go to another country and pick a political side and boost them, right? And I think this is where we get to this question of, is it better to do nothing? The issues with corruption and infighting in the Haitian government are so complicated, and the results are so regularly deadly that it's really risky to pick a side and go with it. So I think that, there's a list here of, stuff that Dubious was accused of, that he resigned from office in 2018 after being accused of corruption and incompetence. It was alleged he had the home of one of Haiti President Moise's political rivals demolished without legal authority. The idea of going after the president's rivals with state power is a pervasive one in Haitian politics and in policing, which again is part of the issue of teaching Haitian police how to use guns better. He was also accused of mishandling the investigation into charges that Moise invested hundreds of thousands of dollars of government funds earmarked for badly needed social programs. So these are all really significant issues. But, once you throw your organizational power behind somebody, you give them legitimacy. So I think a lot of this stuff is really, and then, the other thing that I talked about in this article a lot was this, boondoggle, where they, almost got themselves killed because the Haitian population thought that they were trying to take their natural resources. This is an operation that saved no slaves. This is an operation that almost got a ton of people killed. This is an operation that almost caused disaster for people living in a certain area. This is an operation that re-traumatized, possibly, I mean, I don't know for sure, but likely re-traumatized Gizno Marty and offered him dramatic false hope that his child was going to finally be safe, that his child was alive, and was just out of reach. All that damage and destruction and harm and pain and honestly kind of cruelty, and not thinking, why would it not have been better to not do that? To me, it's out of the question. It would have been better for OUR to not be involved there. It's hard. I would need to hear a very specific story, but it's hard for me to see evidence that OUR being in Haiti has done any good. So, anyways, that brings me to claim 6. The people behind OUR are heroes. I wrote this article when I finished this article and published it right when Lynn Packer's report about that charity letter about Tim abusing those women came out. We since have gotten a lot more information about the specific nature of those allegations. People who have historically defended Ballard, like Eric Mustas, Jimmy Rex, and especially Glenn Beck, have started to push back and say that they feel tricked and duped. I wrote this right around the time that the reports of Paul Hutchinson molesting someone he believed to be a child in the field came out. And the thing that eventually did come out is, I'm going to bring this back to Haiti again. In 2020, David Lopez did an interview with the attorneys general who were examining, not the attorneys general, the agents who were investigating OUR for criminal conduct. And he said that OUR was trying to hide the fact that they were no longer doing direct ops and that no one in Haiti was looking for Gardy. If you look at OUR's social media messaging in 2020, Gardy is all over it. They tell Gardy's story in extended blog form. They release a music video about Gardy. They start selling hats with Gardy. The music video is incredibly misleading. It shows these kids for sale holding numbers when actually that was the police taking photos of the kids with their name and number because they were trying to repatriate kids to their own homes after they arrested Eros. There's a lot of implications in that video of things Eros did or was doing that are actually police actions, or footage that was taken over the orphanage after they had arrested the caretaker and left the kids overnight. And it's not clear whose care it was. And then they photograph how filthy and sad and scared they are after they did that to those kids. Love it. And but anyways, so yeah, that's in 2020. Gardy is newly energized, is the marketing face of OUR. But what Dave Lopez says in his interview is that in Haiti, no one is looking for Gardy. The operations have basically stopped, and And also the other thing Dave Lopez says, and he has documents that he says he and Chet Thomas both produced, is that they actually got the Haitian government involved to prevent someone else from looking for Gardy. Some former OUR operatives had split off and we now know they were following the leads that were created by Janet Russ and the psychic. So it's not likely they were going to go find him. But OUR did try to stop another group that was trying to find these kids. So all that is to say, you take this man 4 years after his kid is missing. You tell him that his kid is alive. You hang everything on this orphanage director who is only circumstantially tied to the crime. You do a sting on her. You say, oh no, Gardy, he's already sold. You chase this idea all over the country with him. You have no evidence he's alive. You have no intelligence that anyone's seen him. All you have is this psychic, and you are using this child who you don't even have evidence was trafficked. There is no publicly available evidence Gardy was sex trafficked. None. Or labor trafficked. There's no evidence for it. But you're using this kid as the face of trafficking. You're dragging his dad all over the country. You're filming him every time you tell him that we're going to find him this time. And then in 2020, you're not looking for him, but you don't want anyone else to find him. What do you say to that? What do you say to that? I can't. So that's that's part of this, right? And there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense about this, of motives and what people are doing and why they're doing it. And what we now know is a lot more details of what Tim Ballard was accused of and why he was asked to leave OUR, and women who've come forward and explained exactly what happened in the ways in which Tim Ballard pressured them to, this is an early list. This is there was a letter that was written by OUR employees. It's from 2020. It's not in the case file. I don't know where this letter was circulating exactly, but it was compiling allegations from employees and volunteers at OUR on this list. One was that an OUR member said that she was sexually assaulted on a jump. Somebody who Lynn Packer spoke to said that she was fondled by an OUR operative during a mission. There's been questions about the weapons side of things, right? Lloyd's of London was apparently really angry that they were not under the impression that OUR people were using weapons, and they were angry that you could see people using weapons and being trained to use them in Operation Toussaint. Some people have alleged that there's a for-profit arms entity attached with OUR that purchases weapons and buys them in places. If this has happened in Haiti, there's a lot of gang violence and a lot of police violence in Haiti. Has OUR been responsible for funding some of that? That's a possibility. And OUR was purchasing arms on the black market. There's the question of whether or not OUR is taking credit for things that it didn't actually do. There's some question there with the funding. Some people have argued, I've heard this from multiple people, that Ballard actually did not have the government experience he said he did, that he worked for a very limited time in the CIA, that it was more of an internship position. And then, of course, what he did in the DHS has been really disputed. It's been alleged that what he was mostly doing was like behind the desk stuff and back office intelligence stuff, not on the ground stuff, which honestly wouldn't shock me based on how bad on being a secret agent he seems to be. And then, of course, doTERRA and other large organizations have had these issues of being horrified by stuff that's happening. And, so there's OUR has a lot of fractured relationships with possible donors. So anyways, and these are all allegations that have been made. There's in this letter that's circulating around. If you look at the FOIA files, you see even more stuff alleged in this. And to me, it's just, I keep coming back to that first sting, right? That first sting of seizing on this man who's lost a kid, and you have no idea what happened to him, but you say he was a trafficking victim. You say that even though you have no evidence that's true. and you say this lady had him, even though you have no evidence that's true. And then you say that she sold him to traffickers, even though you have no evidence that's true. And you just keep going through this like again and again and again and wasting money on this and hurting people and dragging people around. And it's not all because, like, as far as I can tell, because you think you're special. It's hard for me to empathize with that. You know, I understand being sincerely misguided, but I don't understand not learning, and I don't understand not changing course once you have more than one close call. And I don't understand re-narrating these experiences. You know, Ballard's got this whole version of the incident when he was when he was stopped by the people who thought he was taking natural resources. He's got this whole version of the traffickers who all, you know, he started reading the Book of Mormon in his car, and he looked up and they all vanished and no one could understand it. And it was a miracle, even though that's not the version he told when he got back to camp that night. It's not the version he tells in the documentary. I don't understand narrating and re-narrating this story for yourself where you could be learning from your mistakes, and instead you're just turning into more and more evidence of how special you are, just how good and cool and right you are. And I don't, how are you supposed to ever save a kid with that attitude, right? The other, so that then that brings me, of course, to the issue of sexual misconduct, right? Once the fact that Ballard was asked to step down because of sexual contact with female operatives, he went on a couple different shows. I think right before it broke, he was on Marisol Nichols' show that they've since pulled, where he sort of tells stories of how they used to go to these adults only hotels and pretend to be a couple to catch traffickers and kind of like raunch it up for the act. They've since pulled that video, which it doesn't look good. I don't blame him. And then he went on the Adam Carolla show and told some similar versions of this, right? Of all the different things that you have to do to when you have your fake wife in the field to make everything look believable, and that your fake wife is there to prevent people from getting sexually involved with you, because you have to have this fake wife in the field who is believably into you and is gonna be jealous. Yeah, so there's Marisol Nichols, who I don't quite know her part in this story yet. She's come up a few different times around these in Tim Ballard's version of defending these allegations. What is interesting to me is that nearly every OUR operative I've talked to says that celebrities were not sort of given the plusher experience, right? That Ballard would not have done stupid things with them. And Marisol Nichols was also involved in she was involved in some of the net nanny stings, which don't involve this kind of like play acting in the field, right? She was involved in some of those. What doesn't make sense, and again, this is just where I'm like, none of this makes sense. It just makes it just all makes you think that somebody's not telling the truth. Ballard said on the Adam Carolla show that the allegation that he would have women shower with him came from this incident where he and Marisol Nichols were trying to get intel on trafficked children in a spa called the Bunhavo, and that the shower cause was because they were in the spa and they had like taken a mud bath, and they were in their their bathing suits, like everything was totally on the up and up, and they had to shower in there while they were trying to get the intel, but like nobody saw anything, and they're all completely but then they got the intel, and then they found 27 kids in a chicken coop, right? Here's where none of this makes sense. OUR was, according to people in the organization, OUR was not doing operations on the ground in 2020. They had stopped. But the owner of the Bunhavo and the attached adults only hotel was arrested in December of 2020. But the news reports all say that he was arrested by the Dominican Republic, and they never mention OUR. There's also so for one thing, there's 27 people who are removed from the hotel for trafficking, but they're not children in the news report. There's no mention of the chicken coop. And it seems that the trafficking issue was specifically about like visas, right? That like trying to, the Dominican Republic's had a really big anti-immigrant crackdown in the last few years. So it's not clear that like kids were involved at all. It's not clear that they were being held captive, and it's not clear exactly why this person was charged. Was it over sex like slavery, or was it over irregulars with visa? It's really hard to tell from the news reports. But then, of course, this raises the question: was OUR there, and if so, why? Why did people seem to be under the impression who worked at the OUR office that they weren't doing in-person raids anymore? But then Tim Ballard has this very detailed story of needing to be in a shower with Marisol Nichols at the end of 2020. It doesn't add up. It's something's weird there. And so then, of course, that makes you wonder, are these stories true? Like when Tim Ballard was going to other countries and like bringing these women with him, were they on missions at all? Right? Like there's honestly a part of me that kind of wonders that if these cases happened fairly recently, but everyone at the OUR says that Tim doesn't go on missions anymore because he's too recognizable, or like we don't do missions anymore, we just fund other missions. Why does Tim Ballard keep going to other countries with women? Like what is the I wondered that again when I was reading the Glenn Beck report, because I couldn't find any evidence of other people being around these guys in Glenn Beck's interviews with them, right? It's not like what had happened in the past in these stories is that people would be that like the Acapulco incident with Paul Hutchinson, it was Jimmy Rex, Paul Hutchinson, and Tim Ballard were all there, right? It was 3 of them, right? And there was like 3 or 4 guys on all of these jumps, right? But then you read the interviews with Glenn Beck, and suddenly it's just 2 people. It's just a man, it's just Tim Ballard and a woman. So it almost like, I don't know if he latched on to again, I don't even know if there was an operative on the ground in the arrest of Bonjavo. I don't know anything about the case. I tried to get the Dominican Republic judicial office on the phone today, but they said I had to submit a request in paper, in writing, in person. And I was like, I'm probably not going to fly to Punta Cana for this.
Probably not. No.
But if anyone listening lives in Punta Cana, hit me up.
Go.
That'd be great.
It does raise the questions, for sure.
We had similar questions because, what sense does it make to go on an undercover operation with Tim Ballard and Marisol Nichols posing as the people that are conducting the sex trafficking?
Right. They're both recognizable.
So
yeah.
She's going to be recognized at some point by somebody.
So I started reading about this because I started like listening to interviews that they'd done with her, and they started talking about how they got these like super high-end makeup artists to dress them up and have them like be unrecognizable down there. It's like, at some point, like, I don't understand how you're spending your money, right? Is that like, if your job is to go like get information, it seems like what you mostly need is someone who speaks Spanish, who can listen to these things. But like, if the operation is mostly like hang out in the spa and just see if you see anything, then like, why does it have to be Tim Ballard and a famous actress, right? And like, that doesn't make any sense to me either, of like the money and the cause here. But I really do wonder. I don't know. It's just that like the stories being told in these examples of like, the Glenn Beck reports, which we can't substantiate that stuff yet, but like there's a lot of stories that all sound really similar. It just at some point it does raise this question of like, I don't understand how these stories entered the water, or how people got these text messages and photographs if they weren't true, right? But like I don't, why at some point is there this hard turn from highly photographed, highly documented, we write about them all the time, we play them up super big on our website, big operations, and then all of a sudden the only evidence of operations you can find are things that other people are doing that OUR is sponsoring, or these shadowy, strange operations where Tim Ballard is going by himself with one person, and they're in adults only hotels, and they're in clubs, and they're in like, it's really important to have like your upper thigh and pubic area has to look like a trafficker's. Like, how did this happen? Like, so it feels like at some point that there's a, it looks to me that at some point there's a very dark turn towards something OUR doesn't want to report about, and like almost like they don't even want to like they don't even want other people at OUR to know about it, right? Like, how does this go from being such a big production that's so public to suddenly everyone at OUR agrees that they don't go on raids, but Tim Ballard is still sleeping in the same bed with an actress in Dominican Republic? It
More
doesn't
questions than answers.
I know it doesn't add
Yeah.
up, and I know what people are going to say is that, like, well, it's like, this is you got to go to these. There's so many excuses I've heard of this, right? That, like, well, you got to go to these really rough places to find trafficked kids, right? And just, again, then show us the numbers. Show us the numbers of like what you actually did and where those kids are now. Because like all I'm seeing is that this guy got arrested for a spa for a spa with trafficking incidents. You have details of the story that no one else does. They don't ever mention that you were there in the news report. And you say you did that? And you say that you needed to have a massage with Marisol Nichols to make that happen? Show me the evidence. I don't buy it. Or then the other thing you hear is like, these women, like, the thing I hate is the way in which, like, they've kind of implied this idea of, like, oh, this is all this big misunderstanding, right? Or like, this isn't a job for nuns, right? That like people have to be willing to like get really, to really go to dark places to do this. Then don't bring moms from Utah. Like, then why are you? And again, this is why, like, I just keep coming back to the fact that like there has to be another motive here than sincere concern and best practices. That like if everyone knows you gotta, get a Brazilian wax and do sexual things in public to catch traffickers, then why are you picking volunteers from your ward in Utah? Why are you doing like there has to be somebody who's better equipped to do this, right? Like, why are you like? So the motive looks weird to me. And then, and again, I keep coming back to the whole, what was it going to take for you to realize that the psychic wasn't going to find Gardy? What was it going to take? How many years were you prepared to waste this person's life and cause him unnecessary grief before you said, you know what, maybe this person's actually not psychic? How long were you going to do it? And again, it's hard for me to believe that the motives here are honest and good if you don't have an answer to that question, or you weren't asking that question, or you had other priorities besides that question.
I think if we go back to the whiteboard that Tim Ballard did, it answers a lot of those
exactly.
Questions. Why do you
that is a very good point.
Why do you have to be there? Why are you doing things that don't seem to make sense? Well, it's promoting Tim Ballard, promoting Mormonism, and those things are working. So why change? Why look at it and say, how can we fix it when you're getting the result you want? The result they wanted doesn't seem to be saving. No. It seemed to be promoting the Mormon church, promoting Tim Ballard, getting him into either the Senate or into an apostleship in the LDS church. And all of those things were working up until these allegations came out.
And I think that's just what I come back to, is that like the motives don't make sense with what's actually happening here. I don't know, if the allegations for these women prove to be true. I don't know what, I don't know if Tim Ballard, this was like part of his sort of like James, I can't put myself in his head. I don't know if this is part of his like fantasy of like what real sacred agents do, right? And that like, that would be part of his legacy and his image. I don't, I don't know what it is, but it does seem at some point that it's just sort of like, it's all built on this very like Hollywood fantasy idea of like what it's going to be like when you're a secret agent, and that like, you decide one day that you're going to go save the kids who you're pretty sure are there. And you're pretty sure you know how to save them. And the fact that you don't, like, it's just this overwhelming commitment to your own specialness starts to drive the show. And just like how many people had to get hurt because you really wanted to be senator. So it's a dark note to end on. But that's just it's hard for me to look at any of this fairly. And I think if I had anything I wanted to just say to people in the audience right now is just look at all the people who have talked about their experiences, and I think it's fair to start talking about what motives make sense, right? All the people who have split with OUR, who are angry with what's happened there, do you think that they all decided that they actually want to be pro-trafficking after all, after dedicating their lives to anti-trafficking, that they've all decided they're actually pro-trafficking? How come so many of them have started their own organizations or joined up with other organizations? Were they jealous of Tim Ballard's success and didn't want to participate it anymore and wanted to go do something else? That doesn't make any sense. Are all these people just really determined to like hurt this amazing man because like they all hate Mormons? Most of them are still Mormons. Most of them are, or because they hate righteous people. Like, what kind of weird Disney villain stuff are you coming up with? At some point, I think you get to this place where if you think Tim Ballard's telling the truth, no one's telling the truth but Tim Ballard. No one is. And everyone else is just determined to bring Tim Ballard down because they all agree that no one is more special than Tim Ballard. And either you're on Tim Ballard's side because you see how special he is, or you want to fight him because he's so special. And at some point, it just seems to me that a worldview that is predicated on just how special this guy is doesn't make sense to me. I just don't buy it. I don't think he's that special.
There it is.
Yeah.
Those are the words. No, like I said, more questions than answers. Although I feel like every morning we wake up and there's something new about it that we just have to say, did you see this article? Can you believe this came out? So, and I think more and more people are feeling, I don't know, is safer the word to come out and talk about it a little bit. I mean, we had a guest on a week ago who was a former volunteer, and she said up until this point, she had never felt like she could say anything. I didn't even know, and we were personal friends, that she had been involved back in 2014. I had no idea. And she said, I was not ready to talk. Now I feel so many people are. I'm going to come out and just tell my story. And maybe it's a piece of the puzzle. Her story is not the whole thing. It's one view of what happened. But enough people like that, you will start to be able, hopefully, to construct exactly where we're at. So
what I'm concerned about is the people who aren't talking. There were people who were involved who know what happened. Glenn Beck kind of let his media news release come out, but he's staying back saying, I'm too close, I can't speak on this. Well, he had a lot of knowledge and he should be speaking on what he knew and what happened.
Well, and he was involved in the Nazarene Fund thing, and a lot of that stuff is financially really bizarre, and we don't know what happened there, and like where's
Sean Reyes in all of this? We've yet to hear from the Utah AG. Who
he said he's not going to
involved with this.
Exactly. He says he's not going to, endorse anyone for Senate because like this is all too complicated, right? But now we know that he was also under investigation. So that's the other thing is like there's a lot of people we're never going to hear from because they know where the bodies are buried and they don't want to
Elder Ballard is one of them. He's clearly had a big part to play in this, and yet he's untouchable. And they be transparent, be as transparent as they know how to be, as these are Ballard's own words as to what the church is. Why is he not out there telling the people that he promoted this organization? Why isn't he out there saying why this organization is so bad now that he's excommunicated Tim Ballard? Why? What is happening? Why aren't you speaking out on what has happened here? You were part of it. You should be speaking out on it. So it's the low-level people who are speaking out that we're going to eventually find out what happened. But it's not going to come from the people who are the leaders at the top who should be coming out and saying, Sean Reyes, that's his job. He's the AG, is to protect us against fraud and scams. Why is he not out speaking about this?
You see people on social media say things that like, even when I had no money for myself, I gave money to OUR because like I believed I was helping kids, right? And like, and that's like, I get really annoyed when people talk about like, well, let's have it out in court, right? They're never going to get their money back. They're never going to get their money back. Like some of the really rich people, maybe, but like, maybe there's a lawsuit there, or like, some of the women who were harassed by Tim Ballard, maybe, but like the odds it's going to settle out of court and it's going to be all shut down. But like most of the people on the US side who were hurt by this because they're giving money to this, they're never seeing that money again. It's just gone. And it's Ballard's money now. He just has it, and there's not going to be justice for those people. And then the other part of it is, how much money disappeared down these for-profit rabbit holes. The way you could give to CNF was through OUR. We're never going to know where that money went. We're never going to know what it was spent on. We're never going to know how they picked the people who they gave the money to. Like, I don't know. I've seen some of the photos of them like surprising people with adoption grants and a bunch of, airline miles, and they're all in really nice houses. Were they helping people who already had a ton of money, giving them more money, right? Which kind of seems like it was an MO for a lot of this, right? So like, I think that's just sort of the, there's a lot of these stories that are never going to get told because people got something out of it and didn't, and don't want to be the person who gets tarred with the same brush of, yeah, you're right, I did accept $20,000 from CNF, and because I was a buddy of Tim Ballard's and he just gave us the money, so we wouldn't have to pay for an adoption. There's that kind of thing. And then there's a lot of people who, like I said, people who we're never going to hear their stories because they don't even know this is happening, that they, or people who have been trying to tell their stories for a long time and there's no way to vet it because like the way that we vet things in the United States is really dependent on things like official records and dates in written sources, right? Like I feel like every time I'm on social media reading about this, there's somebody who knows somebody who was arrested unjustly, or somebody whose kid, like they don't know where he is because of OUR. And like it could be somebody just saying something, or it could be real. We're never gonna know. And I think that's sort of the global ops side of this is the story that hasn't been told, because there's not really a great way to tell it, because it's so diffuse and so out there. And that's where I keep wanting to, I've fixated on Haiti a lot, but it's because there is so much documentation of these raids and exactly what they did and exactly how they were taken on. And there's a lot of people from that world I'd still like to talk to just to get those stories out there, but, working on it. But, I think the reality is that like there are people who have been really, really hurt, who aren't ready to talk, and who lost a lot, and we're not going to know their stories. And if anyone out there is knows somebody who was caught up in those cases, please reach out. We've been trying to compile a database of people who have footage of overseas ops or were witnesses to them. I would love to hear, there's a lot of stuff that like we're also just kind of getting. People who work in this are still just sort of getting the first stories of, right? Because a lot of stuff is so shadowy. And like I say that, like, some of these ops with Tim Ballard, if they happen in the last 3 years, were they even on OUR's books? Like, some of this stuff is really, really shadowy. So,
no, I think that's a reality. And I think also a lot of people that were on these ops with him, they're still kind of reeling, maybe if they're still a believer in him. And now they are confronted with all of these other narratives and allegations. I personally know of one person that is really wrestling with it, trying to decide, what do I think? I looked up to him. He was everything to me. Now, what about this? So they're not going to talk right now. I mean, obviously they're still trying to figure out what's going on. So I feel like there might be a period of time where people like that have to come to terms and then may be ready for the greater good to come out and say something. But it's going to take time for sure.
And people are grieving,
people are grieving.
People are grieving. People who are involved are grieving. I think this is like, it might sound, it's easy to make fun of, but I actually just think that some people who just like watch the documentaries or even just watch the movie are grieving. That like, I think we live in a really scary time, and people who even just like were really affected by Sound of Freedom, these are the people who I hear from on a regular basis, the people who saw that movie and like they really needed to believe it was true. Like maybe they had something going on in their lives, or they were victims of something themselves,
It's
really
cognitive dissonance. They believed they believed they were going to make a change, and that they wanted it to be true because it made them better people to participate in it. And when you find out it's all a fraud and you've been duped, you get angry.
It's incredibly painful.
Yeah.
Very
and like, how many of those people bought movie tickets for the Pay It Forward program because they thought that this story needed to be told, and only found out later it was all made up? Or like, how many people gave money to OUR after that? Like, I think that on one hand, I think that there's, people who work on this, you see so much frustration of like, why won't people believe anything bad about Tim? Some people really emotionally needed to believe this was true, even if they were only peripherally related to it. But like, people want heroes, and I think that in addition to, I've tried to keep hitting this bell of, remember the global South, remember the fact that there's going to be people who don't have access to our legal system whose stories we're not going to hear. Remember the fact that there are people who, if they speak up in their home context, there's going to be extremely dangerous for them. I think the other thing that I would really want to encourage people to take away from this is be slower to trust people you don't know. And this comes up in the ministry context all the time, of people who throw in their lot with pastors who are these mega celebrities, and who really like change people's lives and really inspire people. They never talk to them, and that person doesn't even know they exist. And then something comes out about them, because it always does, and they find out that this person's not who they thought it was, and it causes this tremendous grief and tremendous trauma. And like, the thing is, if you worked with Tim, you have a whole different, or you worked for OUR, you have a whole different kind of grief that's really complicated. But if you just really wanted to believe the story was true and heroic, don't trust people you don't know. Don't trust people who are on the other side of a computer screen. And if you find yourself looking up to people who you see on television or on the internet more than you look up to people in your own life, maybe start changing that, because this is a relationship that's going to let you down, because you actually have no idea whether these people are trustworthy or not. And Tim fooled a lot of people for a really long time, and I don't think there's any shame in being fooled by him. Like, some of this, I mean, there are people who are very close to it, that Glenn Beck saying, like, I can't believe the dog tag thing was fake. It's like, how did you, what, come on, but like, for other people who, weren't actively perpetuating the scam, I do that. There's no shame in being tricked. It happens to all of us. We all get tricked. And some people are really good deceivers. Darren Fletcher called Tim Ballard, Darren Fletcher, the original, in a Lynn Packer article, interview, I should say, one of the original directors of The Abolitionist, who made the TV series, he called Tim Ballard the best liar he ever met. And one of the Aftercare people who was interviewed this said that like he can spin things like no one I've ever met. That like, this man was an amazing liar. He was really, really good at tricking people, and there is no shame in having been taken in. The question is just, what do we do about it now? And I think we learn from it. I think we learn about trafficking and what it actually is. I think we learn about being responsible global citizens and what an American's role is in the larger world. And I think that we are more cautious and guarded with celebrities.
Wow. No, that's amazing. Your takeaways are just incredible. And like I said, just a fresh and different perspective from what a lot of us are used to hearing. Wouldn't you say, Landon?
Yeah, absolutely. That was what we heard over and over about the first episode was, wow, really neat perspective.
So I'm so happy to be able to bring this second episode, and I would love to invite Laura back on. You say you're working on another article, different things. Let's just keep up the dialogue.
I'd love to.
I think people need to hear it, and just the things that you have to say. I mean, after we taped our first episode, I seriously thought about it for several, just things that you said. I feel like that today, my head is kind of spinning with some of the information, which is good. Cause like you said, this is a devastating situation on so many levels, but there must be some things that we can take away and learn. And I think you've started to outline some of those. So let's keep up the dialogue on that. So thank you. Will you come back on again?
I would love to. Yeah. The stuff I want to keep working on in the future is, I've been in contact with a few people. I want to keep working on orphanages in Haiti and kidnapping and trafficking and just sort of that constellation of issues. So there's a lot more to talk about with that, and specifically how it relates to not just the original Guardian Marty story, but then of course the subsequent arrests and the subsequent hunt for Gardy. But then the other thing I want to talk about is just sort of this, like, how did we how did we as a culture get this idea, this image in our heads of what trafficking is? And like, why was, even Angel Studios and OUR will say about the kids in boxcars in Sound of Freedom, like, oh, that actually doesn't happen, right? Like, they'll even say that in their own material. But then, of course, they're like, well, then why did you put it in the movie?
Yeah, and everyone thinks it happens now because they saw it in a movie. Visuals are way more powerful than anything else.
And we already had that image in our heads because we already had this idea of kids being like shipped overseas in shipping containers. That like people were saying, this is a big part of QAnon lore. Like when the boat got stuck in the Suez Canal, they're like, oh, I bet it's because there's kids on the shipping. What? No. And so I think that like, and this question, like where this iconography comes from is really interesting. And how did we all get this in our heads that this is the thing? And why was this all just lying there, right, for Tim Ballard to be like, I'm going to be the one who stops it with my particular brand of slumming it in strip clubs and kicking down doors? How did we come up with this narrative and all thought it made sense when it really doesn't? So that's what I'm working on next. Can't wait to talk to you more about it.
Excellent. No, that's good, because I think there's this whole climate of fear that's getting more and more palpable and palatable after the last couple of years, and people just need a place. They need a way to construct it, a place to put it, a place to channel it. And so this is all part of that. So we'll continue this dialogue. All right, everybody,
I'm excited.
Please comment. There's so many things in this that you can comment on. We'd love to hear all of your perspectives. Talk right to Laura. I know that she's on the comment. She's answering things. I'm sure you guys have questions for her, and just more about her perspective and the things that she studies. She's kind of doing the hard work out there, and we get to benefit from that by just understanding and hearing the perspective. So we appreciate that. So all right, like and subscribe to Mormonish if you want to be made aware of when new episodes come out. You can hit that donation bell, and if you'd like to help support Mormonish podcast financially, there are links to PayPal and Venmo in the show notes. And please look for more that we're going to do with Laura. It's going to be a wonderful collaboration. So thank you, everybody from Mormonish. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.